The auction block in Natchez, Mississippi stood in the town square, where everyone could see it. A wooden platform worn smooth by thousands of feet. Thousands of people who had stood there while strangers examined. Their teeth like horses, squeezed their muscles like livestock, calculated their worth in dollars and cents. The summer heat of 1843 made the air shimmer, made breathing feel like drowning, made the waiting even worse than the inevitable sale. Sarah was 23 years old. She had been sold twice before, separated from her mother at age 12, sold again at 17 when her first owner died and the estate needed liquidating. This was her third time standing on an auction platform while men decided her future without asking her opinion, without caring about her thoughts, without acknowledging that she had thoughts at all. The auctioneer's voice carried across the square, describing her in terms reserved for farm animals. Strong back, good teeth, no visible defects. Suitable for field work or breeding stock. That last phrase made several men in the crowd lean forward with interest, and Sarah felt her stomach turn even though she'd eaten nothing that morning. Thomas Whitmore stood at the edge of the crowd, 47 years old, owner of one of the largest cotton plantations in Mississippi. 1,200 acres of bottomland that produced fortunes every harvest season. 73 enslaved people who worked those fields from dawn until dark, their labor transformed into Whitmore's wealth. Their suffering converted to his comfort. But Whitmore wasn't looking at Sarah the way the other potential buyers did. His expression held something different, not the usual cold calculation of how much work she could perform, how many years of labor he could extract before her body gave out. His eyes held something that made her skin crawl despite the oppressive heat, something that suggested his plans for her were worse than the brutality she already knew. He paid $300 more than the highest competing bid. The auctioneer's gavel fell like a death sentence. Sarah's hands were bound, and she was loaded into a wagon that would carry her to Whitmore's plantation, to whatever hell he had planned for her. The Whitmore plantation sprawled across the landscape like a kingdom of cotton and cruelty. The big house stood white and imposing, columns reaching toward a sky that seemed to turn away from what happened beneath it. Behind it, the slave quarters lined a clearing, rough cabins that housed the people whose labor made all this possible. Beyond that, various outbuildings, barns, storage facilities, the infrastructure of a plantation economy built on stolen lives. But Sarah didn't go to the quarters. Whitmore intercepted the wagon at the property line and directed the driver toward a structure that stood isolated from the other buildings, separated by 50 yards of cleared ground. The breeding barn. Inside, the air hung thick with the smell of hay and animals. Stalls lined one wall. A small room had been constructed in the far corner with a door that locked from the outside. And in the largest stall, separated by heavy wooden planks, stood the reason Sarah had been purchased. Caesar was a Hereford bull, 2,000 pounds of muscle and animal power. Whitmore had imported him from England 3 years earlier at considerable expense. The bull represented progress, modernity, scientific agriculture. Caesar's calves sold for premium prices across 3 counties. Strong bloodlines producing desirable traits, superior characteristics passed from parent to offspring, and Thomas Whitmore, who had spent months reading agricultural journals and attending lectures in New Orleans about improving livestock through selective breeding, had developed a theory. If animals could be improved through careful breeding, if desirable traits could be enhanced through controlled mating, why not apply the same principles to his enslaved workforce? He believed he could create hybrid offspring. Children who combined human intelligence with animal strength. Workers who could labor endlessly without complaint or exhaustion. The perfect merger of human and beast, of cognition and physical power. Revolutionary agricultural science that would make him famous and wealthy beyond his current fortune. It was pseudoscience built on racism and delusion. Evil dressed in the language of agricultural improvement. Madness given legitimacy by a society that had already decided certain people weren't fully human. But in 1843 Mississippi, where enslaved people had no legal protection, and owners had absolute power over their property, who would stop him? Whitmore kept detailed records in a leather-bound ledger. He had learned from his agricultural reading that proper scientific experiments required documentation, careful notes about conditions and outcomes, methodical tracking of variables and results. He recorded Sarah's arrival with clinical precision. Age 23. Height 5 feet 6 inches. Weight approximately 130 pounds. Physical condition excellent. Previous births, none recorded. The small room in the corner of the barn became her prison. No window except ventilation gaps near the ceiling, a straw mattress, and a chamber pot. The door locked from the outside with a heavy iron bolt. Through the wooden walls, she could hear Caesar moving in his stall. The deep breathing, the occasional stamp of hooves. The sounds of an animal that had no idea what role it was supposed to play in Whitmore's experiment. The first attempt happened on a Thursday morning when the temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees. Whitmore had prepared carefully, consulting his breeding manuals, ensuring all variables were controlled to his satisfaction. He knew how livestock handlers positioned animals for breeding, how they timed the process, what environmental factors affected success rates. He tried to apply these principles to something that violated every natural law. What followed was screaming that could be heard across the plantation. Field hands working half a mile away stopped their labor, sweat freezing on their backs despite the Mississippi heat. Women near the big house felt their stomachs turn. Old men who had survived decades of brutality found tears on their faces. The experiment failed, as nature demanded it must. Caesar showed no interest in anything except returning to his stall and his feed. The bull's instincts recognized that what Whitmore proposed defied every biological imperative coded into millions of years of evolution. But Whitmore blamed Sarah. His careful records that evening included detailed notes about how the subject had failed to cooperate, had somehow sabotaged the process through resistance or unspecified deficiencies. The failure couldn't be his fault. The theory was sound, therefore the problem must lie with Sarah herself. He would try again, and again, and again. The attempts continued throughout July and into August with disturbing regularity. Whitmore adjusted variables with each failure, like an agricultural trail that simply needed better calibration. Different times of day, different preparation. He consulted his breeding manuals obsessively, searching for techniques that might make the impossible somehow possible. His frustration grew with each unsuccessful attempt, and that frustration expressed itself through cruelty. Sarah received less food, 1 meal of cornmeal and scraps daily. Less water. The logic was simple in his mind. Animals performed better when desperate, when survival itself became motivation. The other enslaved people knew what was happening. Information traveled through the quarters in whispers and meaningful glances. They had seen Sarah briefly on her arrival. Then she disappeared into the breeding barn and never emerged. Her screams punctuated their days. But resistance meant death. Speaking out meant the whip or worse. So they worked their fields and carried the weight of knowing while being powerless to stop it. By September, Whitmore had attempted his experiment 17 times. 17 sessions documented with scientific precision. 17 failures that he attributed entirely to Sarah's deficiencies, rather than the fundamental impossibility of his design. His wounded pride festered. And wounded pride in a man with absolute power was perhaps the most dangerous thing in Mississippi. Curthers, the plantation overseer, had worked for Whitmore for 6 years. He had seen cruelty in forms that would have shocked his younger self. But this was different. The sounds from the breeding barn invaded his sleep and made him reach for whiskey before noon. One afternoon in September, he found himself walking to Whitmore's office without consciously deciding to. He chose his words carefully, speaking of practical concerns. The other enslaved people were disturbed by the noises. Work efficiency had decreased measurably. Perhaps the experiment had run its course. Perhaps Sarah could be assigned to normal duties. The temperature in the room dropped. Whitmore's voice remained calm, almost gentle, which made his words more threatening. The experiment would continue as long as he deemed necessary. Any overseer who couldn't support such vital work clearly lacked the vision necessary for continued employment. There were plenty of men in Natchez who would gladly take his position. Curthers left without another word, shame and anger burning inside him with nowhere to go. By October, Sarah's body was failing. She had lost significant weight, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that seemed to shrink daily. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor. Her eyes had developed a 1,000-yard stare that indicated her mind had retreated somewhere the present couldn't reach. Whitmore summoned Dr. Harrison Colby, who maintained a practice serving the planter class. When the doctor arrived and led to the breeding barn, the smell hit him first. Unwashed body, animal waste, decay, approaching death. Inside the small room, Sarah lay barely conscious on straw that hadn't been changed in weeks. Dr. Colby examined her with professional detachment that years of training had instilled. Severe malnutrition approaching starvation, critical dehydration, multiple contusions, early signs of organ failure. Without immediate intervention, she would be dead within 2 weeks. Outside, he explained this to Whitmore in clinical terms. Then Whitmore explained his experiment. The theory about cross-species breeding. 6 months of attempts. Revolutionary agricultural science. Dr. Colby stood very still. His medical education had included biology and anatomy. What Whitmore described was biologically impossible. Humans and cattle were different species. No amount of force or proximity would change fundamental genetic reality. Whitmore's face darkened. He didn't appreciate being lectured by a country doctor. He had read extensively. He corresponded with agriculture experts. If the experiment hadn't succeeded, it was because of deficiencies in Sarah, not flaws in his methodology. Dr. Colby faced a moral crossroads he'd avoided throughout his career. He could report what he witnessed, but the authorities were either related to or economically dependent on the planter class. Whitmore was doing nothing illegal under Mississippi law. He could refuse future calls, but that would damage his practice irreparably. Or he could do what most people did when confronted with systematic evil: convince himself he was powerless to change anything. He chose the third option because it was easiest. Before leaving, he wrote prescriptions for Sarah that he knew Whitmore wouldn't follow. Paper shields against his own conscience. December brought cold that penetrated the barn's cypress walls. Inside Sarah's cell, temperatures dropped low enough that her breath became visible. Whitmore's ledger entries had grown erratic, filled with angry observations about Sarah's failure to cooperate, her stubborn refusal to produce the results his theory demanded. He had attempted the experiment 32 times. Each failure only convinced him he needed to push harder against natural laws that insisted what he wanted was impossible. On Christmas Day, while plantation families feasted, Sarah lay in the barn with no awareness of the holiday. Her body had entered the final stages of starvation. Her mind drifted in and out of consciousness, but some part of her remained, some core of self that refused to completely disappear. Whitmore visited that afternoon slightly drunk, annoyed that his experiment still hadn't produced results. He looked at her deteriorating body with frustration and contempt. In his mind, she had failed him. By late January, Sarah had been imprisoned for 7 months. 7 months of attempting the impossible. Her body somehow clung to existence despite every reason to surrender. On February 14th, Whitmore decided to attempt the experiment one final time, the 45th attempt. But this time, Caesar had reached the limit of his tolerance. When they tried to lead him from his stall, the bull refused with active aggression born of prolonged stress. Caesar charged, 2,000 pounds of fury, crashing against the stall door with enough force to splinter wood. Whitmore and Curthers ran for the exterior door, barely escaping before the bull's horns would have gored them. For 30 minutes, they stood outside while Caesar's rage found expression in destruction. The sounds of splintering wood and furious bellowing carried across the plantation. Eventually, the sounds quieted. Curthers carefully opened the door. The barn's interior looked like a storm had passed through. Stalls demolished, equipment scattered. And Sarah's small room had been partially destroyed when the bull's rampage took him into that space. She was still alive, still breathing, untouched by Caesar's rage. The bull's fury was directed at the structure, not at the other victim of Whitmore's obsession. Whitmore stood looking at the destruction with shock and anger. 8 months of effort had yielded nothing except suffering and wasted resources, but even in this moment his mind couldn't accept responsibility. Sarah had failed him. He sold Caesar to a Louisiana plantation. On February 18th, he gave orders to Curthers move her to the slave quarters. Let the others deal with her. He was done. Ruth and 2 other women took charge of Sarah's care. They cleaned her gently, revealing the full extent of her deterioration. They tried to feed her broth, though she could barely swallow. They sat with her through days and nights, offering the only comfort available: human presence and gentle touch. Sarah lived 13 more days, surrounded by people who had suffered under the same system but never endured anything quite like what Whitmore had done. On February 23rd, Ruth felt Sarah's hand tighten in hers. Her eyes opened and focused for just a moment. Her lips moved. "Remember," Sarah whispered. A single word. A plea that her suffering not disappear into silence. "I will," Ruth whispered back. "We all will." Sarah died just before dawn on February 24th, 1844. The women prepared her body with rituals the plantation owners didn't understand. Samuel made a wooden marker with her name carved into cypress wood. They buried her that afternoon beyond the cotton fields. Ruth spoke at the burial. She asked us to remember, so we will remember. We'll tell her story to our children, and they'll tell their children. And someday, when this evil system finally ends, people will know what happened here. They'll know her name. Thomas Whitmore never attended the burial. He was in his office calculating the financial loss Sarah's death represented. In his ledger, he marked the venture as a failed investment. His conclusion: breeding experiments proved unsuccessful due to subjects' inferior constitution. Theory remained sound despite implementation challenges. He never acknowledged that the theory was biologically impossible. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain his worldview was absolute. The breeding bond stood empty after Sarah's death. Whitmore never repaired it. The structure slowly deteriorated until nothing remained except foundation stones and memories carried by people whose testimony was never recorded in official documents. But Sarah's story survived. Ruth kept her promise. The story passed through generations as oral history. Sarah's name appears in no official records except an auction ledger. She has no marked grave that survives today, yet her story endures. It testifies to the specific cruelties of the plantation system. It reveals how pseudoscience and racism combined to justify the unjustifiable, and it demonstrates the resilience of human dignity, even under conditions designed to destroy it completely. This is Buried Truths, where we refuse to let these stories disappear. Sarah deserved better than what happened to her. She deserved to be remembered not as property in a madman's experiment, but as a person whose humanity was stolen but never truly destroyed. Subscribe so these voices continue reaching people who need to hear them. Comment below, how do we honor the people whose suffering history tried to erase? Until next week, keep digging for truth.